Yay! Arian, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How are you?
I'm good. Sorry, it took one try wasn't enough first time. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
I think we'll just give a minute for everyone to roll in. Where are you dialing in from
I'm
today?
dialing in from Washington, Covington, Washington.
Covington. I'm in Seattle. If you're joining the live, feel free to uh, shoot out where you're coming from too. And we'll get started. Ariane, thank you so much for being our guest of honor for the June edition of the Polite Conversation that we have every month. Um, I guess just to begin, full disclosure that you very recently are now a part of the Polite team, along with the Infuse team as the Director of Science. Do you want to share a little bit about that latest development?
Absolutely. I'm super excited to be joining the Cannabis Therapeutics and Enfuse team and really just bring the messaging and, mission that the team is bringing to the industry as a whole. I'm extremely excited to work with such an innovative team.
Yay! Yeah, we've been waiting, and finally last week you started, and so this is a great kind of part of your entry into our world, and ours into yours. So well, I was so excited that you could join us. You wear a lot of hats, and you've worn a lot of hats in the industry, from cannabinoid scientist to a tech entrepreneur to an advocate. Do you want to give just a quick introduction of yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, Instagram. Oh, you can see that this is one of
Yeah.
my early lives. I've lost my phone.
It's okay.
So, a little bit about me. I'm a molecular biologist, and I trained at MIT in molecular biology and chemical biological engineering. That had been sort of weirdly my passion since I was a child. I loved to ask for microscopes or chemistry kits for my birthday, where my brothers were asking for Jordans. That turned into a lifelong curiosity about how human disease and therapeutics get developed. And so I've spent about 5 years in the executive cannabis space, working as chief science officer for quite a bit of companies in California, before realizing that I wanted to change the way the course the industry was going. And I realized that it had to be through technology and education. And so I started working with teams that really were trying to advance those prerogatives through their product offerings. And so that's how I found the amazing Enfuse and Canvas team and sort of a lot of the teams that I've been aligning with over the last year, including the Doctors Knox. And so I'm extremely excited to share a little bit about that and how we can all work together to advance this industry.
Yeah, before we dig into the kind of professional side and the science-based experience you've had, um, I wanted to hear more about your personal journey, from childhood, from the family you grew up in, and how that led to you entering the industry.
Absolutely. So I will say that I've had a much longer history in with cannabis and the cannabis plant. So I smoked my first joint in the fourth grade. I had siblings that were very active participants in the legacy market. And so a lot of where I am today, why I went to MIT, was shaped by this plant. My brother was almost murdered in 2002 for a few pounds of cannabis. And by the time I had reached his age, I was processing hundreds of pounds in a day. And so I had this really foundational relationship with the plant and what it meant culturally, how it was a financial system, and how really it was used for several different reasons in our community, whether it was health and wellness or creativity or to provide for your family. And so I got to see all of that really early on, and it shaped some of the most transformative parts of my life.
Did you, as a child or in your formative years, did you think you would be working in this industry the way you are now, or was it kind of an unexpected
Very
evolution?
unexpected. So I had sort of shaped myself to be the counterexample to my family. And so I wanted to do my MD PhD. I wanted to do everything, do the straight and narrow. And by the time I had gotten to MIT, I was a 17-year-old president of, SAD and Students Against Drugs. And I had a very negative concept of the plant because it had, caused this huge schism in my family and really affected their ability to provide for their children. And so I wanted to take the complete opposite route. And then at 17, I joined a fraternity. I had been reintroduced to the plant in, the recreational space. And I realized I had purpose in this industry. I wanted to really resolve how the opportunity was unfolding. As I was in school, I also started to get symptoms from Crohn's disease, and I realized the therapeutic benefits. I realized if there was such a deeply culturally entrenched use of this plant that I needed to discover the science behind it. Like, why has this persisted for thousands of years through all of these cultures, and we don't have the scientific data to really point to a specific answer or use? And so I had to do something. And so after college, I worked at Fred Hutchinson for a while doing cancer research. I worked at Georgia Tech, and I wasn't getting the scientific curiosity, the level that I wanted from science. And so I realized cannabis was this huge opportunity to connect all of these pieces that shaped me, my culture, my scientific curiosity, my engineering, and then the entrepreneurial aspect of it. Because I had such a fundamental understanding of how the legacy market operated, how could I translate that into, creating a successful model that really was culturally appropriate and that took the full scope of what this plant had to offer.
So you're, coming from being exposed in your environment to then, it sounds like in college is when you had a more personal relationship, right? Because it either healed you or helped you. What was it like when you started to see the science behind all of it?
It was a major event in my life because I didn't start at the science. What I realized is that I needed to work every part of the supply chain. And so I started, after I moved from Atlanta, I started trimming. I was a karaoke jockey. I was trimming cannabis and medicinal grows. And then I moved on to cultivating my own gardens for quite a while. And then at that point, there was this massive industry shift in 2016. And so prior to 2016, nobody wanted a chemical engineer or molecular biologist. They wanted people from established markets, Colorado, who had extraction experience. And that's the only science that the industry wanted to hear is, could you run an extractor?
Okay.
And so I had to keep trying to get my foot in the industry. So I cultivated, I did all of the parts of the supply chain distribution. And then I had gotten my break in 2016 when I had moved to California. I had started 3 cultivations with 100 lights and $10,000 in a dream. And then I got poached by one of the largest manufacturers who finally realized that science was going to be the differentiator in the future. People who could bring validation to this market and start justifying claims. Because we don't fall into the FDA purview, we can't make claims around the plant, but we know culturally, historically, that this plant is efficacious.
That's the irony, right? That it's called the medical market, but you can't, make claims that it has health benefits. But on one hand, I think it's an interesting reversal of, a lot of times people want facts and evidence, and that has to come before, there's mass adoption. But in this case, people have so many firsthand experiences or with a loved one. And once you see that, it's almost like the science is just the cherry on top.
Absolutely. And the way the industry has been shaped, the pressure of competing with the legacy market that, the core values of the legacy market are completely different than the values of the adult use in the medicinal market. And
What would you say
One,
that those core values are in the legacy market?
absolutely. And so this is one of the things that I get most frustrated with,
Okay.
is that when we had a legacy market, we couldn't base our decisions on a brand.
Mm-hmm.
We based our decisions on quality, the smell of the plant. There was no package. There was no you can't brand something like cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
We had certain things: consistency, quality, and obviously price point and convenience.
Okay.
But everything was a delivery. Everything wasn't centralized, and once the recreational, adult use, medicinal market, lens was applied to the industry, they couldn't compete. They
Mm-hmm.
couldn't compete in creating a distribution or a grassroots type of economy. And so what they did is you regulate out those people, you centralize, and
Mm-hmm.
then you make the focus on branding and brand identity rather than the quality of the start material or the quality of the cultivator, which was what we had. And now we focus as a consumer with our eyes rather than
Yeah.
our nose. And so it's caused this massive shift in nomenclature, a massive shift in, what the consumer is prioritizing and what is
Mm.
dictating that consumer behavior.
How do people uh kind of overcome these? I guess in some ways they're all layers that separate, how people actually identify or understand quality. So how do people kind of cut through all the BS, you know, as more
Absolutely.
layers get put on, this industry and the products and
I think I believe it's a brand's job to educate their consumers. And if we're thinking about what brands should really represent in this industry, it should protect the purpose of the plant, and it should protect the mission statement of the cultivator and the supply chain that's involved in that product, right?
yeah.
I'm okay with that type of branding,
Hmm.
because in Gen Z consumer behavior, we are starting to think of companies' social policy and their ESG scores in our purchasing decisions. And so that
Hmm.
does matter that they're doing it correctly. But what really is most important is the education that every consumer needs to have. Every
Yeah.
consumer should have a base level understanding of the supply chain, which means that there is a cultivation point, there is a point where the form factor is being decided, and then
Hmm.
there's a point where it's being tested in a laboratory to make sure that what is on that certificate of analysis actually is in the bottle or the form factor that you're using. Understanding how to read a certificate of analysis, understanding the key components of a
Yeah.
certificate of analysis, that is what every consumer should be able to do, like an ingredient label. And
Hmm.
it's up to the brands to put the emphasis on that,
Yeah.
and regulators, of course. But the purpose of regulation and the purpose of a brand is not to educate the consumers typically. It's to regulate the market and make
Hmm.
sure taxes are being paid across every channel.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are some of the biggest education gaps that you see now?
I think some of the biggest education gaps, well, beyond the scientific ones, right?
Okay.
Because we were living under a regulated paradigm where we couldn't research
Yeah.
domestically, and so there's a lot of gaps in terms of
Catch up. Yeah.
what is our scientific and our clinical understanding of this plant, and
Hmm.
how formulation and different form factors are affecting efficacy. That, as a whole, is why I'm in this industry. It's why I constantly have curiosity,
Hmm.
because we need to uncover those factors that have driven the historical use of this plant in all of its purposes, whether we're talking, therapeutic or in textile. There's, so many use cases for this plant. And I want to identify what underlying mechanisms are driving those opportunities for us.
To kind of decode all of these benefits that humankind has been
Exactly.
gaining from it. Wow.
And it's the science, and then the other education gap, I think that it's why I've been building technology, is supply chain. the general consumer's understanding of what is a supply chain and how does a supply chain affect me. I think COVID has sort of woke up the world a little bit to access
Yeah.
to raw
And how
materials and ingredients
vulnerable.
and how
Yeah.
vulnerable. But we've become, because of big technology, because of companies like Amazon and Google, our lives have become so convenient that we've become detached from the supply chain.
Hmm.
I always mention to people that the average head of lettuce comes from 1,000 miles away, and it's just you don't think about it when you're at the store. You're thinking about, do I like the brand, and
Yes.
is the price point in my
Hmm.
price point? That's what we think of as a consumer, but there's a lot of steps from point A to the point B in
Hmm.
the process of getting a product, especially in such a highly regulated industry. And so educating the consumer about how the supply chains work and also how legacy supply chains work,
Hmm.
because those built the industry, those built the economy. Now we have this superimposed, regulated market on top of something that already existed. And
Yeah.
what we know is that every product is not created equal and every product is not inherently safe. And if you are going to purchase a product in the regulated market, you have to understand that that product probably has a twin in the unregulated market, or somebody is trying to get a product in your hand.
Hmm.
That's what's happening in this industry. We are throwing so many products at people now without the education to look and see, is that package actually compliant? Is that
Hmm.
package from where it says it comes from?
Mm. Just kind of what are the standards and how do people actually know how to differentiate the smoke and mirrors of that branding can do versus, real efficacy or real transparency.
Absolutely. And
Wow.
it's after California's legislational shift, it has become an even greater problem because counterfeiting and fraudulent
Hmm.
behavior, even in the people who are teetering between the regulated and unregulated market, it's still happening. It's happening all
Hmm.
across the U.S. and it's not going to stop because we've let legislators and people who actually didn't have experience in the legacy market define the rules.
Mm.
So you have people making the rules who don't understand the science or how it actually operated. They understand regulated markets, but they don't understand the cannabis market. And so you're not going to stop something that's 8 times larger than
Hmm.
the recreational market.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so every consumer needs to be equipped with identifying key factors in the product and in the product quality
Hmm.
to protect themselves first and foremost. And I think that if I had to fill any educational gap is starting early, telling
Hmm.
people about how to really make your choices in this industry.
What are some of the kind of misleading ways that people tend to make choices, and what should be the driving factors instead?
Oh, you know, the misleading ways, there's 100 ways in this industry. Once we allowed the marketers and the public relations engine actually define the parameters of the industry
Hmm.
rather than the educators, the healers, the scientists, the
The
clinicians.
clinicians, yeah.
And there's so much we have to do as an industry. And again, it comes down to every consumer should have the basic knowledge of cultivation,
Hmm.
extraction, and what they are putting in their bodies. If you're buying a product at that gas station or at a CVS or Walmart, it's now so prevalent.
Yeah.
And we're testing our CBD on ourselves every day. We're putting it in every type of form factor. But we're letting people who actually are there for the business, they're there for
Hmm.
the ROI,
It,
dictate the products that we have up, at our
hmm.
availability.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to ask you about, something related is a way to counter that is through clinical experience, right? So how did you, I know you were already in on the scientific side of it, but how did you get specifically into the clinical side of cannabis?
So I've always been interested in pharmacogenomics. How can we tailor drugs to our personal biological makeup?
Hmm.
Because I have so much disease in my family. We have autoimmune conditions, a lot of gynopathic conditions, and I was seeing that all of my family members were using the cannabis plant to treat
Hmm.
their symptoms. But we had no way of sharing that data with each other, and we had no way of actually interpreting the data. Obviously, I do because I'm a biologist, but my
Hmm.
family is not full of scientists. And so I knew at that point I needed to figure out clinically how to start validating why are
Hmm.
we using this and how do I do it in a way that sort of fits the growth of this market,
Hmm.
because the economic incentives that are happening are greater than the incentive to study it and to research it.
Yeah, almost like it's not required to
Exactly.
do well in this industry. Yeah.
But to actually advance, to innovate, means that we have to research. We have to be able to do decentralized clinical trials and take all of this data that's happening every day and actually interpret it in a way that can increase outcomes for patients.
Hmm.
This every well, I don't want to say every, but in the past, each market started off as a medicinal market. And
That's
once
right.
recreational legislation went into place in California, that became a figment of our imaginations. We just forgot that
Mm.
the medical community has needs and they're the most pressing needs. And if we're able to make products that are efficacious and have quality for the people who need it the most, then the rest of the market will be okay.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
rest of the market is going to be happier because we're driving our metrics based on outcomes and
Hmm.
efficacy rather
Hmm.
than what brand has
It's
the best packaging and position on the shelves.
Yeah, to have a health-based paradigm instead of a consumption-based paradigm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Outcome-centric economies. That's
Hmm.
I would love if we can get back to that.
Yeah. And so how part of your experience is very strongly in formulating award-winning products. Um, how, from a formulation standpoint, like how did you learn what has efficacy, what has therapeutic benefit, and how do you make those decisions as someone influencing how something's formulated?
Absolutely. So when I do product development, formulation, one, I have a fantastic network of
Hmm.
people who are much smarter than me, including Dr. Zoila Zadran, a
Hmm.
very extensive network of scientists and chemists that have inspired me through my
Hmm.
career. And so what we all do is we start at the can we find primary research? You start like a scientist and an engineer, and then you put on your commercialization hat, and not the other way around. I don't hear a new buzzword and think, oh, I should go formulate this
Yeah.
because it's going to be hot in the market. I start of what system am I trying to target?
Hmm.
What predecessing research and clinical data sets can inform the design? And then you design in an iterative process and test and capture data.
Hmm.
And you let data be your guide, not responses from bud tenders. Not that I have anything against, the bud tender audience because they drive consumer behavior.
Yeah.
But when we are giving recommendations, it should be based on what are you looking to do with this form factor,
Hmm.
and what problem or lifestyle are you
Yeah.
trying to address through this use of this plant?
Hmm.
We
And
don't
to be
ask enough.
purposeful and to be
Exactly.
intentional about it. Yeah.
We don't ask enough questions. We are driving the market with reactions rather than asking questions of the consumer, asking questions of ourselves, like why are we selling this unique cannabinoid or this form factor
Yeah.
to this client.
How is it gonna help somebody,
Exactly.
Yeah, what is it gonna do for them? Oh. And so how when you think about how to evolve the industry and increase better access, access is becoming less challenging, but what are the ways where you think people still have barriers to getting relief, to getting the education they want? What are the biggest things in the way right now?
That is a fantastic question and very nuanced because I think there's stuff in terms of the industry composition as a business
Mm-hmm.
that needs changing, including diversity and having women and BIPOC representation through the entire supply chain at every point, including the C-suite. I
Yeah.
think those factors are really going to sculpt access in the future, and how do
Mm-hmm.
we create equitable products that are efficacious again, that borrow from that legacy market core value set. I think that is the biggest thing I want to see in the industry, because we're not taking in all of the data and the culturally significant use cases of this plant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important, because if we detach that heart from it, we are going to lose the consumer that has been using the plant for decades.
Yeah.
And the second would be to see the change of how we view branding
Mm-hmm.
as okay, I look at the branding after I look at the quality, after I look
Mm-hmm.
at, is this the product and the cultivar and the chemotype for me?
Mm-hmm.
We have to start at the science and then work our way to the mission.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think the two things I would love to see this industry have.
And what are a lot of the products that we're focused on are low THC, and rich in the other cannabinoids that are slowly becoming more accessible, slowly becoming more known. Um, through all your years of research and formulating and touching every part of the supply chain, like, what are your thoughts on how people currently view cannabinoids, and specifically THC and CBD being the most kind of famous ones at this point in history?
Absolutely. I think we are, again, now that we are letting science have a voice, we're starting to think about, there are hundreds of cannabinoids and terpenoids in this plant. And why has marketing of these two cannabinoids taken precedent over the plethora of others? It's because if we start thinking about the minor cannabinoids and the opportunity mill, we lose focus on driving an industry forward that is based on THC percentage
Hmm.
and branding.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, how strong is it
Hmm.
in brand?
Yeah.
We're losing the fact that there's an entourage effect, that terpenoids and minor cannabinoids are actually as important in our outcomes, in our wellness, than THC and CBD. But
It's almost
because,
like, oh, sorry to interrupt.
no, no, please.
Like, when I talk to different customers and people that try polite, there's almost this experience of rediscovering cannabis, because people in this day and age have only come to know, the more high THC focused options. And so when they try full spectrum, or they try some of these minor cannabinoids and the herbs, it's like, whoa, I didn't know it could do this for me. Or there's a rediscovery there. I don't know if you find that as well.
Absolutely. The industry is it's it is a rediscovery, but it's not a rediscovery for science,
Yeah.
because
No.
we've discovered these already. It's a reimagining of how we're telling the story around this plant that has this deeply rooted history that has been sort of wiped out of our brains.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
and even as recent as the 60s, right? I always find it so interesting when you talk to people that are like 60 or 50, they're like, oh, the weed is was so different, like when I was a kid. Um, so even that is so telling how fast we came to focus in on, a very limited view of cannabis.
Absolutely. And I sometimes like think about it, and the fact is that this plant has had a long time to evolve. And the science we've had to actually understand it is a very short history.
Yeah.
And although it's becoming faster and faster, our technological advances, it still doesn't compare to how much diversity this plant has had and history this plant has had.
Are
And it makes me feel very excited to be able to discover that.
are there um are there any inspiring stories of historical use that has kind of stayed with you or been an inspiration for how you look at the science of it from formulating or even as a consumer yourself?
I mean, in terms of historical use, I've been, you know, it's been associated to my community for before I was born. So it's
Yeah.
always been a part of the cultural expression, the creative expression in our
Hmm.
community. The cannabis use is spiritual, it's biological, it's financial. And so I love to borrow from other cultures, from Ayurveda, from TCM, and try to tell people that it's not just cannabis that we're looking at. Our endocannabinoid system, there's many plants that produce phytocannabinoids, whether we're talking about cavalactone, echinacea,
Mm.
black tea, chocolate. We have to stop limiting our understanding by thinking about this one regulated plant. And we need to sort of break the divide between hemp and cannabis. It is one biological system that master regulates all of these other systems. And we're constantly interacting with it with our endogenous cannabinoids, with
Hmm.
phytocannabinoids, and in some cases, synthetic cannabinoids. And so I like to take a step up from the cannabis plant sometimes and talk
That's
about
a
the
really good
system
point.
view.
Yeah. And there's so many levels to take it up. There's plant-based medicine as a whole, which I think we're definitely in a new era. People talking about psychedelics and all these new integrative options that were just not even accessible socially, or legally. But then you have like, holistic health, like Ayurveda, all these more integrative systems, more whole person ways of looking at health. Um, and I know one thing we talked about was how the current view of cannabis is so binary. Whether you're talking about indica, sativa, rec, med, THC, CBD, like what are what are some of these binary things that you still see people kind of stuck in?
Absolutely. Ah, and
Which ones bug you the most?
this is the nomenclature wheel mill. I would love a science based, a clinical based lexicon. Like we should be using science to lead how we're defining these moments in cannabis, these new moments in cannabis history where business defines what we're calling something. That indica, sativa, hybrid, all of it puts the focus on simplifying something that is so complex.
Hmm.
Like we should be using the words that describe things that are associated to the outcome in a person. So a chemovar, not a
Hmm.
strain. A chemotype, not a terpene profile. Like
Hmm.
various chemovars are produce various chemotypes, and this type of language or code switching, I understand it when it comes to the cultural relationship to the plant. Like if
Yeah.
you want to call it weed, if you want to call it marijuana, that's yours. But when we're talking about talking to each other, talking to a consumer, or educating
Hmm.
somebody, we need
Hmm.
to use the correct terms
Yeah. Yeah.
because indica does not mean you're going to be sleepy. And sativa does not mean you're going to be awake.
Yeah.
It means that it is associated to the grow pattern, the growth of the plant.
Hmm.
It's not actually related to the chemotypes which cause effect.
So
So,
there's a lot of not just oversimplification, but
yeah,
misinformation baked into all these terms that have become the standard way of assessing cannabis, right?
yes. In
Yeah.
trying to meet your personal cannabis needs with a word that really is not associated to an outcome.
Well, yeah, that's been, part of when we started Polite, we very consciously wanted to put the word cannabinoid forward, which in itself is, you know, not everybody knows what cannabinoids are yet, you know?
Hmm.
And so but we wanted to present this idea of it's not just THC, CBD. It's this whole spectrum of compounds that like you said, we're just scratching the surface of, but many that we already have enough evidence and experience to know that they're therapeutic, that they're beneficial.
Absolutely.
Do you think, when you think of existing paradigms like, let's just say vitamins, right? We're now at the point where you may not know exactly what vitamin A versus E does for you, but you understand that there's this huge, rich spectrum. Is that, if you look at that as an analogy, is that what you hope people will come to understand cannabinoids as, or are there other models that you hope cannabis can get to in people's minds and how society understands it?
I mean, there's an inherent versatility in the plant, whether you're talking about textiles or nutraceuticals or biopharmaceuticals, or if we're going to make novel cannabinoids that are, more therapeutically advantageous than an opiate.
Hmm.
I think there, because of its complexity, because of the opportunity that the plant gives us, I don't want to limit it into
That's
a
true.
box.
Not even just as a food or
Exactly.
a smoked or consumed thing. That's a good point. It's so broad. It's it's utilitarian. Yeah. And not even to mention on the whole nutrition side of hemp seeds, right?
Exactly.
Um,
It's a food source. It's a textile source. It's a source for so much, and we're just uncovering things that we knew already.
yeah. Yeah.
Like like there's cultures who were building economies around this plant long before we were here,
Mm-mm.
and we are rediscovering
Yeah.
those uses.
Mm-mm. What's something that, as someone inside the industry and so interconnected with uh the data, what's something that's already accepted as fact, in the world of cannabis and cannabinoids, but that the public maybe is either still not sure of or weighing, or it just hasn't become information yet for the masses? Is there anything that's like, as a scientist, it's like you already know this, there's no disputing it, but it's just a matter of people um, getting educated?
Whew. I mean, what do we know? Well, we know people love cannabis. We know that the community is purchasing it. What can we claim in terms of science? There's lots of data, wet lab
Mhm.
data, that shows in vivo and vitro that cannabis is controlling our homeostasis.
Mhm.
The endocannabinoid system has now, you know, people are finally okay with talking about it,
Mhm.
saying the word canna. And
Yeah.
so, you've got the New York Times years behind producing the article recently saying that the runner's high is
Mhm.
not endorphins, it's actually endocannabinoids. Like, these
Yeah.
are things that science knew. They knew it long before the New York Times published it,
Mhm.
but it's until the population is ready to hear it. Until sentiment is not on stigma, it's on science, we have to deal with this slow uptake into the educational component to this industry. And so
Mhm.
we know when you run, you are stimulating your endocannabinoid system.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think something we often talk about is how, the medical world doctors are not necessarily even learning about the endocannabinoid system, even though it's something that's already been well established. Do you see that? Do you see any positive signs of the clinical medical community getting more educated as the public does at the same time?
Well, this is why I'm so thankful to have the network and teams that I do, both at Pivotal Health and at the Ames Institute.
Mm-hmm.
It's this type of cross-industry collaboration where we're working in tandem.
Mm-hmm.
Science is working with clinicians, is working with supply chain to actually create data and evidence-based use cases of products. And so I'm seeing now associations, ACHEM and CHEM, building groups of physicians who are interested in creating subspecialties in medicine,
Mm-hmm.
because we cannot have doctors out there prescribing pharmaceuticals and prescribing a plethora of drugs to all of these different systems without understanding how our endocannabinoid system is going to affect that drug's use. And so I'm really excited because we have like the Doctors Knox and we have the Ames Institute team building that education base for physicians and for people in a clinically relevant way. And so we are on a renaissance right now where the emphasis, I think, is being refocused on public health.
That's a really good point. I think in the past, all the partnerships in this industry are more about business, right? And consolidating investments and more capitalist drivers of those partnerships. And everything you're talking about is getting back to more purpose-led and people-driven partnerships, right? Where
Absolutely.
um
Because
and
if we lead with those values, people driven, outcome driven, the product will sell.
yeah.
People will buy it.
Hmm.
And you know, I was at MIT 2006 to 2010.
Hmm.
We would pay a lot more for our cannabis then. Not obviously the regulatory paradigm, made it more expensive, but
Uh-huh.
we didn't have a package or a shiny stick. It was quality, and here's the $60 for my eighth. Take my
Mm-mm.
money, because all I care about is the quality.
Yeah.
And if we can return to the values of quality-led economies, then we'll be able to pay the farmer.
Hmm.
They will want to research the efficacy of their cultivar. We could
Hmm.
pay the manufacturer because they will spend the money to make a better product if they realize that, oh, I don't have to spend all this money on marketing and Facebook. Well, you can't Facebook ads. We don't have those
Yeah.
as an industry. So it's extremely expensive to market in this industry. It's extremely hard to get market share, especially when you're competing with all of these other pressures on the supply chain. And so
Mm-mm.
I'll be excited when we can lead with those type of values again.
What do you think? How has the boom of the hemp market affected this whole ecosystem, either from a more business-driven standpoint or even a more kind of cultural standpoint?
I cut out for a second.
Oh, I was asking, we talked about hemp versus cannabis and how it's an artificial distinction, but the industry, the hemp industry has blown up, right? So how is that affecting, this whole ecosystem of cannabinoids, cannabis as a whole, as as the hemp industry
Absolutely.
takes off?
So the it's it's all regulation based.
Yeah.
If you're over a certain percentage of THC, you fall into the cannabis regulatory market. If you don't, you fall into the hemp regulatory market. We know that both of these markets have a place.
Hmm.
And because we've separated them, it's like they've become estranged in the consumer's mind.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the same thing.
Hmm.
We're talking about a plant that produces compounds that affects our endocannabinoid system.
Mm-hmm.
The hemp market has given brands an opportunity to sort of destigmatize in a direct-to-consumer model, which is fantastic for the cannabis industry,
Mm-hmm.
because direct-to-consumer is one of those legacy market values that I was just talking
Yeah.
to you about. It's like
Yeah.
we want our wellness delivered now. It's
Yeah.
we want convenience as a consumer, and also it's given brands the ability to explore the minor cannabinoids
Mm-hmm.
in a new way. And that is really what I think the hemp market has done so well for the cannabis industry. It's opened up the conversation. It's opened up the fact that, okay, this plant does have utility, not only as in the regulatory market, but also in the hemp market and also in the textile market and the food market.
Mm-hmm.
It's allowing regulators to see the economic advantage without the psychoactive component, which people get hung up on.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. It's it's filling out that story, that whole story that hasn't been allowed to be told for many years, right? And I think as part of, as cannabinoids become more accessible, the stereotypical types of people that come to use it and accept it changes, right? You have more elderly people, the market targeting women is growing a lot. And I know you've spent a lot of your um, career focusing on women's health, on the health of underserved, marginalized communities. What are what are some of the ways you think that we as an industry need to better serve the needs of seniors and women and other maybe overlooked groups when it comes to cannabis and cannabis-based medicine and products?
Absolutely. We know that these underserved groups, these opportunity zones, these, they're centers for wellness issues and lack of care.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also the centers of distrust of traditional healthcare and traditional pharmaceutical industry. We need to address the hardest community problems with the plan. Show that we can target a problem and
Mm-hmm.
resolve it for this community. That is more validation than any billion-dollar brand could ever bring to
Mm-hmm.
the global market.
Mm-hmm.
And we've just lost track of it. We've also don't like layering stigmatized conversations over stigmatized conversations, right? We're talking about a plant that has caused all of this warped behavior
Yeah.
domestically. And then
Mm-hmm.
you put women's health on top of it, one of the most underinvested and overlooked investment spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And so over the last few years, I've been trying to develop a team that understands that we cannot move this industry forward until we solve these problems.
Mm-hmm.
This is where we have the greatest health inequity in women's health.
Mm-hmm.
When we have 1 in 10 women suffering from endometriosis or polycystic ovarian syndrome, we have absolutely effed up. I'll say it that way,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a $50 billion financial burden a year. If we
Mm-hmm.
just allow it to take, it takes us 6 to 10 years to diagnose. We've just lost track of these conversations.
Yeah.
We've
Nobody's
normalized it.
prioritizing
Hmm.
how to solve these widely experienced ailments and conditions, right? They just get kind of un they live in this no man's land, right? Of nobody really knows what the cause is or how to treat it exactly.
Absolutely.
And looking at all the use cases of cannabis, is it filling the gaps in the ways that maybe some of traditional healthcare or pharmaceuticals have overlooked?
You know, when you just rephrase this to me, it hit me that cannabis, it was traditional healthcare
Hmm.
before we banned it.
Hmm.
It is the tradition,
Yeah,
and we've now let pharmaceutical companies make us think that is
the
the
standard.
standard,
Yeah, yeah.
and it isn't. We used to use historical use of plants and
Mm-hmm.
entheogens. That's how we treated our ailments. We didn't
Yeah.
do it by going to the pharmacy
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and doing band-aid medicine, putting a superficial band-aid over our problems. It, Wellness, health and wellness, it means going deeper. It means going to that spiritual, that level that you have total wellness, mind, body, spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to get back to that concept as a global cannabis economy, as a global cannabis community. We need those values.
Yeah.
And it stresses me out when I see somebody who's never took a second to think about how long it takes to cultivate, to care for these plants, and
Mm-hmm.
how much energy it takes. Like, I challenge everybody to try. If you're in
Mm.
a place where you legally
Allowed to
can grow
grow.
as
Mm-hmm.
a medical patient or as an adult, try to grow a single plant.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell you, you'll have a much more profound respect for what it takes to be a part of this industry and what it takes to actually deliver a product that's efficacious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, hopefully we can be a part of telling those stories that aren't told enough yet, you know. I like what you said earlier about the analogy of, we just buy things from a store, or we like kids not knowing that chickens are animals because they come in little clean chopped up pieces. It's all that same uh need for back to the roots, right? Going back to the roots. Yeah. I'd be excited to one of our medical advisors from the Ames Institute, Dr. Agwal. He is a cannabis geographer as well, so he studies like the cultural, historic use, and it'd be fascinating to get him on one of these weekends to talk more about that, you know,
Absolutely.
you know, and the kind of ancient traditions around it. Um,
So important.
so what, as time's almost up, if somebody's new to this world, let's just say my mom or someone just turned 21, or um, there's so many things to navigate, from culture, from stigma, from laws, transparency, quality, you know, how would you advise them, in terms of protecting themselves as a consumer, as a user, as a patient? What are the top two things that they should focus on and try?
Absolutely. So the top two things that they should focus on, one, which has been a consistent theme in our conversation today, education.
Yeah.
Why are you trying this product?
Hmm.
What outcome are you trying to have? And are you educating yourself around the factors in that product and in that brand supply chain that could impact your health?
Yeah.
Start there.
Yeah.
After you educate yourself on what system you're trying to have an effect, what purpose you are using that plant for, then the second thing is vetting out the source.
Hmm.
Do you know where that plant came from?
Yeah.
What we have to realize is that marketing terms are what we are basing our decisions off of. Clean beauty,
Hmm.
natural. Those are
Hmm.
marketing terms. Those are not
Hmm.
validated terms through the FDA.
Yeah.
And so natural does not mean safe. Clean beauty does not mean it's, safe for you. It means
Hmm.
that we are marketing that we've put plant material in this product. Doesn't
Hmm.
mean it doesn't have heavy metals or pesticides. So make sure that you're looking for those key factors. Has it been tested by a third party lab? Has it been tested for pesticides, heavy metals, contaminants?
Hmm. Yeah.
Educate yourself and then make sure you're looking at what you're putting in your body. And
Makes
then,
me, yeah, makes me want to create like a little cheat sheet for people. Like the first time they walk into a store, or like, what do I, oftentimes people don't even know what to ask, you know, and how to ask the right questions. So maybe that's something we can work on, like a resource for people.
absolutely,
Yeah.
that is critical.
Okay. last question. If you close your eyes and you fast forward 10 years in America, uh, what do you hope to see when you look around at how cannabis has evolved?
If I was to speed forward, I would hope that the industry is led by people who know what they're doing,
Mhm.
people who focused on being, you know, conscious cultivators, scientists, clinicians, and most importantly, the consumer should be dictating the industry behaviors, how this industry is working and being regulated. It should be the
Mhm.
consumer. It should not be these people who are just thinking about turning it into a money factory.
People,
And
people led. Yeah,
that's what I want to see. Decentralized cannabis, global cannabis communities that work together and accomplish based on outcomes.
yeah. I think that is you in a nutshell. I think that's what you embody in a nutshell. So, if there's any questions out there before we log off today, feel free to send them forward. Otherwise, Ariane, thank you so much for spending a precious weekend time with me and everybody here. And I'm beyond excited and grateful to get to be part of your team.
Thank you. I feel so blessed and have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.